and thanks for joining me today as we continue to talk about the joy revolution. One of the most quoted verses in the entire Bible that talks about joy is Nehemiah 8:10, that says, "The joy of the Lord is our strength." I mean, what an amazing truth to understand that God's joy brings strength to our lives, that when we allow His joy, which is an extension and an expression of His grace, when we choose and we say yes to His joy, that His joy brings strength to our lives at our weakest places. It's an amazing truth. But what even makes that verse more amazing is when we understand the backstory of Nehemiah chapter 8. The book of Nehemiah is really the story of the people of Jerusalem. They had decided to dishonor God. They had decided to rebel. They had decided to not listen to the warning voices that He had brought into their lives. And because of their own choices and because of sin, God had allowed their enemies to come in and destroy them. The enemies came in. They took many of the people captive. The Bible says that they utterly destroyed the temple. Not one stone was left upon the other. They burned all of the gates of the city and destroyed the walls. And so Nehemiah goes back to help these people not just rebuild walls, but to rebuild their lives. When he got there, he found a broken people in a broken city. These people had lost identity. They were humiliated. They had become used to being exploited by their enemies. They lived a life of shame. Again, they had no sense of security, a very insecure life. And so God used Nehemiah to help rebuild the walls of this city and to reestablish the gates, which provided them protection. But more than that, it gave them a sense of identity. And at the end of this project, the Bible says that Nehemiah and the leaders gathered the people together. They prepared a celebratory meal. But before they entered into the meal, they prayed and they sought God and they asked Him to forgive them for their choices, and they repented and they sought His grace and His mercy. And God extended His grace and mercy. And the Bible says that when they finished praying and asking God to forgive them, that instead of celebrating, the people started weeping. They started crying. And it was at that point that Nehemiah made this amazing statement that is so often quoted, where he said, listen, it's not time to weep. It's not time to cry. The joy of the Lord is your strength. What he was saying to them is this: listen, it's settled with God. He's forgiven you. Why are you continuing to weep? Why are you continuing to cry over issues that He's already settled? He says it's time to rejoice. It's time to celebrate the goodness of God, God's restoration and His work in your life. Boy, a lot of us can relate to that, can't we? Because I think there's a lot of us who spend a lot of time living lives full of regret, living lives dictated by shame, still humiliated by our past. There's some of us who our lives are continuing to be defined by what happened a year ago or 2 years ago or 10 years ago or 30 years ago. And we go to God, please forgive me, put my life back together again. And guess what? When you asked Him to forgive you, He did. But the challenge is this: much like the people in the book of Nehemiah, the issue wasn't that God hadn't forgiven them. They hadn't forgiven themselves. And you and I, we struggle with that, don't we? We struggle with letting ourselves off the hook. And so we live lives continuing to weep and cry and rehash issues that God's already settled. Shame's a powerful thing, isn't it? Shame is that force in our lives. It's that voice in our head that points the finger at us and says, oh, you're still dirty. Yeah, you're the one. Yeah, we all know what you did. Shame is that voice that doesn't let us off the hook. It's that ongoing accusation in our lives that regardless of how many times we ask God to forgive us, we never let ourselves off the hook. The problem is this, is that shame and joy cannot coexist, because shame, it challenges God's grace. Shame says you can't trust God's grace to forgive you. It challenges God's grace, and we've learned that joy is an expression, an extension of God's grace. So if I struggle receiving His grace, not just receiving his forgiveness, but his grace that empowers me to forgive myself. And I can't trust him. Joy can't grow in that environment. It snuffs out joy. And that's why Nehemiah said, guys, you got to forgive yourselves. You've got to quit weeping over these issues. Your past is over. Your life is no longer defined by your past, but it's defined by the grace of God at work in you. So rejoice, celebrate, and let God's joy strengthen you. That was Nehemiah's message to the people of Jerusalem thousands of years ago. And guess what? That's still God's message to you and me. Guys, one of the greatest challenges I've always had in my life is forgiving myself. Letting myself off the hook. Nobody can beat me up like I can. But guys, as we choose joy, as we say, no, I'm going to allow God's joy to revolutionize my life. One place that starts is by allowing his grace to empower us to forgive ourselves, to silence shame, to silence accusation, and choose joy. Listen, if you've asked God to forgive you, he's forgiven you. It's time to stop crying about it, choose joy, and celebrate his goodness. Guys, we love you. We're praying with you as we all move forward together in the Joy Revolution. Bye-bye.